So, welcome. Good morning. Just a few ideas about today. It's hard to talk about my dad's work before we get there, and I just kind of want to preface this by saying this is not necessarily the be-all and end-all of all things Granlund going on here. I mean, this is just going to be one perspective of maybe Paul's life and how it related to his interpretation of his upbringing and whatnot, and kind of an outgrowth and outcropping of what he grew up around, what kind of influences were important to him. I know that we are really celebrating the lives of Clarence and Naomi and those kinds of relationships. And so I was just hoping that this tour today might help us all stimulate conversations with each other about the kinds of experiences we've had with our own parents and grandparents, and how we might see some connections between each other through the way in which my dad expressed himself. A lot of these expressions are going to be in Lutheran churches, and Paul was raised Lutheran, and obviously Clarence was Lutheran, and I think Naomi was too, to a large extent, but I'm not. But I hope that our view of the work that we see today kind of transcends mere Lutheranism. First place we're going to go to is Lutheran Church of the Good Shepherd. We'd actually been members there when we were young. My sister Gretchen was actually confirmed there. Some of the first works that Paul ever did were commissioned there. There's a set of doors. There's two different pieces that are going to be there. There's a set of doors and a crucifix. Paul started his career in about 1950, or declared that he was going to be an artist in 1950 to have visited Naomi. His career spanned, I think, well, that would be 53 years. Yeah, he was 25 when he declared he was born in 1925. So yeah, he would have been 53 years. But the recurring themes that you're going to probably see during the day today, we're going to go from like some of his earliest pieces in the Twin Cities to some of his latest. This is the crucifix I was telling you about on the bus, the triple crucifix. And this is actually dated 1964. And like I said, there was a small piece, a very, very early, very simplified piece that sat in Naomi's house for years and years and years. I believe actually that this represents the Christ piece here as we're looking out here. I would certainly hope so. If you're going to be walking into a Lutheran church, you'd want to see Jesus someplace. But as I was describing too, there's absolutely no cross in this. In the United States, we look at a church and we look at the cross, and the cross is empty. And that's to serve as a reassurance that Christ has died, Christ is risen, and is no longer on the cross. This is a pretty stark reversal of this, in that there's no cross except for in this kind of cruciform shape at the bottom. What this seems to emphasize to me is the relationship that Christ brought to the world in forgiveness of both of the thieves. This individual is turning his head toward Christ. This one is not turning towards him so much, but looking a little bit further away. I would assume that could interpret that this is the one who said, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And this is the thief who said, well, we're all going to die anyway. What do you care? Well, whether you care or not, we're all crucified with Christ. Christ is inexorably tied to good and bad in us, not just those of us who try to be Christ-like. So, shortly thereafter, this is 1964, I believe these panels here are the actual door panels. As you see the doors here with the squares represented, all these doors were actually very, very solid. And so all these panels actually were on the outside of the building, where people could actually grab hold of these. These were the actual door handles between the two pieces, so they'd open as double doors outward. And so this is actually panels reflecting the Apostles' Creed, or called credo doors. It begins here actually, and instead of reading left to right or right to left, they read down and up. And so there's a symbolic sense of reading. So I believe in God the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth, and his only son, the birth, the Virgin Mary, crucified on the cross, died and buried. He ascended to hell. On the third day again, he rose. On the third day, he rose from the dead. He ascended into heaven. So there's an actual physical experience of speaking about faith in terms of this is God, this is in heaven. We come through this. Christ, or God becomes man, or Christ becomes human. He's crucified and comes back up. And then the doors that were next to it then are here also. And then here again, it goes from top to bottom to top. So I believe in the Holy Spirit, a high spiritual value, a value we have in heaven, the Holy Christian Church, which is here on earth with us, the community of the saints, and excuse me, this is a depiction of Martin Luther King Jr. This is an actual depiction from the Memphis Hotel as he was assassinated. So this was made in 1968, just after the assassination. So this is one of the first representations of Martin Luther King as a saint. And then we come back here to forgiveness of sins, that which happens here or brings us down, the resurrection of the body for all of us in community, and the life everlasting. Example of the different kinds of symbols and symbologies that also go very, very far back into Paul's history. A lot of the representations that you will see in these kinds of squarish masses or cubic masses help symbolize death or the tomb or the box. And so when you see things that are like this, you might want to key. It doesn't necessarily always mean that, but it means there's an aspect somewhere there that's defining life or defying life. And there'll be other pieces on the tour where those kinds of things are actually split apart. And so that represents the broken tomb or the resurrection and the hope of resurrection. So this here, it's not just the cement tiles that were on the pavement around the Memphis Hotel, but it's actually the ground itself is affected by this event. This actually dates back to Dad being stationed in Japan. It was on the island, I believe, of Okinawa. Okinawa had been taken over just before World War II and was actually kind of a separate culture from that of Japan necessarily. When the Okinawans buried their dead, they didn't just bury them in caskets or boxes or whatever. They would actually place the bodies in a fetal position. And that, to Paul, was very, very powerful also in that it had that fetal sense of hope and also that sort of seed shape that you would see in the life contained inside the seed. So it's both hope and death at the same time. Anne actually did a performance of a piece that was a musical piece that was based on this piece of artwork.
The words of this were written by Susan Palo Sherwin, and she's married to David Sherwin, who is a very well-known musician and hymn festival organist here in the Twin Cities. But she wrote this text, which is based on this sculpture. And so it's the four seasons, and she goes through in 447, it goes through all the seasons of the year, and then the way that all these seasons are connected to Christ the vine, and yet, all of our life comes through Christ the vine. Her husband wrote an anthem with that tune, and on the cover of the anthem is this sculpture. So I did this with my choir a couple of years ago at our church, and a slide presentation that went with it that had a picture of Paul's sculpture and explained what the symbolism of it was. And it was just, the choir got so much out of it, and the congregation too, because of the connection that we had and how we're all connected through Christ. And, all of our lives, all the seasons, all the stages of our lives come through him. So anyway, all of her poetry is right here, and it's based on this piece.
When my dad got stuck on modeling things, especially if it was a female figure, on the arms, he would have Edna come in and pose with her hands. So if all these arms on the women look fairly familiar to you, check out Edna. Is a family grouping, and so there's going to be a lot of reminders of family groupings and the spirit and sharing, and I think it's appropriate for a family reunion. Our next stop is going to be a bit of an Easter egg hunt. It's a very, very large piece in downtown Minneapolis. It's at Westminster Presbyterian Church. Our weird secret little things that we know about Clarence and Naomi, or about our parents, or their relationship with each other, that we could share. Like one story I remember my father telling me was that when he came back, I think it was between World War II and when he went away to college, he was at a church picnic, and at the church picnic they were playing softball, and his dad got up to bat, and he hit a stand-up triple. He hit the ball and took off like a shot. And my dad stood dumbfounded on the sidelines looking at his own father. He took off like a rocket. And it was a stand-up triple, got to third base. We had a deep, deep love for baseball. But my dad, being super surprised, said, "Where the heck did you learn how to run like that?" He said, "Oh, no, I used to run cross country." He was a long-distance runner. And nobody ever knew. So all kinds of odd little surprises about another reflection I have is about Naomi. She used to bake these beautiful, vast array of Christmas cookies, and she would take all kinds of time and make all different kinds of cookies. It was just a beautiful, beautiful thing to have at Christmas time. And I looked at my dad once. I said, "You must have lived like a king. Your mom baking cookies like that all the time like that? I can't believe that you're not, 700 pounds. He says, "Oh, no, my mom didn't start baking cookies until we'd all moved out of the house." As you can see, some of the similar elements are true in this that we saw in some of the original pieces that we saw at the Good Shepherd. And here, these angular sort of geometric forms seem to be quite a bit more celebratory, although at its basis is the fact that there is this sort of split and opening. I don't know if you can see quite clearly that there's a fetal figure here at the bottom. This piece is called the Birth of Freedom. There's an associated biblical quote here: "Stand fast, therefore, in the liberty wherewith Christ hath made us free, and be not entangled again with the yoke of bondage." So this is a symbolic freeing of the spirit, it being in bondage at the bottom, and at various stages raising to higher freedom. But in this, the geometric forms are taking a much more celebratory nature than necessarily a death-born nature. There is a little bit of remnants of a cruciform shape in that the base comes up and is narrow and it broadens out, but it really shows kind of a freeing of the spirit through this new kind of cruciform structure. This entire sculpture actually had been stationed directly underneath the rose window out in front of the church here, but as the church expanded and took over this property here and remodeled, they actually moved this piece, so a very Herculean effort on the part of the church. Made it quite a bit more accessible, as you can see by the ramp all the way around it, so it became quite a bit more inviting as a space. It was interesting to note that although the piece was designed specifically for that location, again, like the doors, I think this is a very, very honest movement of this piece rather than a loss of meaning or interpretation of the piece like we saw on the doors from the Good Shepherd. And also it helps celebrate the accessibility by having a ramp here so people can actually read it more readily. As it was placed out here, the road was actually a lot closer to the front of the church as well. So in order to enjoy the piece, you almost had to stand in the bus route in order to get a full glimpse of it. And photographs were nearly impossible unless you were staying at the hotel across the street. As I had pointed out on the bus, this is actually designed for a very long, low, sloping angle of viewing. This is actually sitting very high up underneath the building, and the plaza went up diagonally. So to actually see this in context, you really have to get down quite low, because this oval shape was actually designed so that at that angle it would appear as a circle. This piece is rather unique from most all the others we'll be seeing today, because this is truly a secular piece, not a sacred one necessarily. This being the Federal Reserve Bank, it was designed to represent our understanding of sense of values, whether that value is monetary or whether that value is philosophical or religious or personal. This piece is called The Time Being, and it was installed originally in 1973. It was one of the first larger pieces that Paul made when he moved down to St. Peter, Minnesota. So this was actually made in the shop at Gustavus. The Time Being, a work both figurative and geometric, depicts a man emerging from and yet contained in a negative relief described by an encircling cubic form. In creating this work, Granlund remembered a device Da Vinci used for defining human proportions, a man inscribed with a square and a circle. But Granlund finds his work that this man becomes alive beyond the limitations of these proportions and splits the pattern. In a statement released in 1973 in a dedication of Time Being, Granlund said, "Man, the measurer of time and space, who used the square to measure the globe and the circle to measure the edge of the universe, also measures his own value. This sculpture celebrates a man as a value maker whose reaching energy and imagination exceeds the limits of his own self-imposed systems. Besides combining figurative and geometric elements, the Time Being incorporates both positive and negative forms, the positive emerging male figure and the negative imprints in the squared circle from which he has sprung. The combination Granlund finds particularly satisfying for expressing simultaneously those facets of human experience which are explicit and implied." I also have a poem that was written by John Calvin Rysmicki, also called The Time Being. A man coming forward leaves a hole in time he cannot see any more than the hole in space where he just was. He can pivot, flex, bend, reach, spin, chase himself in circles, and never sees it. He leaves it all behind, the print of the face, the work of the hands, the mark of the nerves, like a trail of coins dropped by someone else to collect or spend. He peels the past forward and rips the future back. He is a wedge in space, his life a wedge in time. He moves at angles to everything, splits time into the geometry of dance. His sweat has the smell of forever. Too much energy to stay quiet on any surface, he reaches up and out to eat the stars. For him, the sun is gold, the moon is silver, the earth is round and worth saving. Various of these surfaces had been buffed to a very, very shiny brass surface, and so there's not quite the kind of impact that it had when it was first installed. This entire surface was actually brushed bright brass. One of the effects of having moved it to this site from the building we were underneath or behind is the fact that this whole building is built in limestone, and so all the rainwater and cast off from the elements are helping create this green haze here now. A problem we've also had in St. Peter, Minnesota, because most of the stone comes from Kasota, which is the next town over from St. Peter, and it's all limestone, so it has a lot of alkali, and so it's actually affecting the surface. If you can feel this here, you can feel it's actually pitted. When it was first put in here, it was really, really, really very, very smooth. Another fun fact and secret of this piece, one year for Christmas, while Susan and I were very, very poor, we toured the Twin Cities area and took black and white photographs with a camera of our children in front of the various pieces and gave those as gifts and frames to Paul and Edna. And in front of this piece, they'd about had it, and we're starting to take licks at each other. So we're going to have a recreate the original. This piece is entitled Man Nam, and if you look at the plaque here, if you get around to it, it's playing on the palindrome, or the positive-negative effect, positive-negative aspect of man and Nam being opposite each other. This was erected in 1970 as a memorial for the Vietnam War. And I quote, "In the midst of their pure logic, the sculptures of Paul Granlund run the full gamut of human emotions. Man Nam is angry and defiant. Why do the heathen rage and the people imagine a vain thing? Here is unregenerate man turning himself inside out, flailing against an impenetrable wall and coming out the other side empty and shattered. He has, with the utmost violence of his nature, and with the full exertion of his powers, physical and mental, thrust himself in self-destruction against himself. And he has bounced back in horror, seeing what he has done and seeing himself for what he is, a monster who has become what he has made. His arms have lost their roundness and become hollow in their transformation into the wings of an airplane. His humanity is emptied into the reductionism of smooth techniques. His body is taut and determined. His visage is eager and clouded. He is a man who has gone to war to win an ideal, but too late he finds his ideal is demonic." The name of the piece tells the story. The particular war in Vietnam is the type of all war in which man reverses himself and becomes no man, a Nam man. Unlike other Granlund figures, which are graceful and fluid, this man is rigid, stiff, and brittle. Again, as in all Granlund sculpture, there is movement. There's a story that carries us through a climax. Here the tragedy is total. Man has broken himself against himself as he emerges from his masochistic war with only hollow pieces of himself. This is also kind of interesting because this is one of the few pieces that I've actually been inside of. There are a couple of pieces where, in order to pull these pieces of metal together, my dad would weld a couple of little and actually pull them together with a vice grips. While he was with the welder on the outside, someone who was in 6th grade at the time had to crawl up inside and hold the vice grips together so they could hold them in place as he welded the rest of the sculpture together. And one of the worst situations could ever be is that if you're inside one of these large pieces of metal, holding on in the dark with your eyes squeezed shut so you don't see the flash from the welder, if something doesn't quite fit and you don't know it, somebody's father is going to walk up, go get a ball-peen hammer, and start smashing on the outside of this giant bell-like structure right next to your head to make things fit. So part of the fun and joy of helping Dad in the shop was having him ring your chimes for you, so to speak. I believe Paul was rather liberal in his political viewpoints, and at the point at which this was installed, there was actually a Republican governor in the mansion, and it was through the work of a lot of very rich liberal people who put this together to have this installed in the grounds. Also, to note too, is the orientation. There was a woman by the name of Rosalie Butler that lived next door, and she at one point complained in the media that this was purposely pointed so its backside was facing her house as an insult. Also very interesting in the installation that all the surfaces down below, as you see, it's kind of a terrazzo kind of here. There's actually concrete poured up inside of here with a siphon. One of Paul's best friends from childhood was Keith Carlson, and he actually made the plastic tubing. He had a plastics company and made the plastic tubing so that concrete could be poured up inside this form to secure it to this location. He did that after I came out when I was holding the vice grip, so yeah, thank goodness. As you stand directly here, you can see the cross in the shape of the shape of the cross in between these various geometric shapes. So here again, the geometric shapes may or may not be representing death, but the space left in between is the space cut through space and time, which forgives us all our sins before Christ and all our sins since Christ, through Christ, because you can see the image of what would be Christ's body impressed upon those surfaces. This being a college campus and being a religious college campus, I think it's a Missouri Synod. It's also very joyous. I mean, it's right here by their chapel, but it's also celebrating a lot of relationships that begin here, and also the long-term relationships that a lot of colleges have with their alumni and graduates. This is a portrait of Lindbergh as both a boy and then as the accomplished aerialist, the accomplished pilot. He recounted how he had imagined, he dreamed of maybe becoming a bird at some point, because he dreamt of flying across the river that ran through his hometown. And he cited that as probably one of the biggest inspirations in his life to encourage him to try to fly across the ocean, because he always wanted to be a bird and learn how to fly. So this is celebrating those kinds of dreams that we have when we're young and the kinds of things that we accomplish, hopefully, in our lives once we become more capable. A lot of people were astonished because when Paul would model these things, he'd start with a wire framework, an armature that he would put the clay onto, and so he would build things up. But he actually modeled all these figures actually nude and then put clothes over them, so we knew that the clothes would fit. Bourget Field in Paris, where Lindbergh landed. I believe there's another one in San Diego, because I believe that there's an airport named after Lindbergh in San Diego, or he spent a lot of time in San Diego. So there are several of these around the planet, rather than just this one. This is entitled Bethesda Angel. It's from John, the 5th verse. I think it's actually incised all the way around the base. This is a rather early piece, 1966. I believe this was placed in 1968, but it has a reference to a lot of the older works. One thing I think I failed to mention is kind of a difference in the way in which a lot of this was modeled. As we look, if you can remember, just even looking at the Lindbergh piece, all the surfaces, even though they were clothed, the boots, the laces, everything was very, very smooth. And I think later in Paul's life, things got much, much smoother as he went along. I mean, the modeling. This is what you would call very actively modeled. And so the clay that he was modeling this with was really very moist, and he could push it and squeeze it and get a lot of detail in this as well. One of the things you can notice too is if this is the Bethesda angel, well, we don't know what angels look like, and nobody ever saw the Bethesda angel actually. They would just only look for the disturbance on the water and a quick dive into its healing waters. What Paul tried to do in here is kind of redefine things. I mean, there are some descriptions in the Bible of what, 7-winged seraphim, and I mean it wasn't very humanesque. I mean, we think of angels and wings on their backs and things like that, represented in a lot of religious art, but this is pushing things in a whole new direction and trying to redefine, well, how about if angels are very, very fast because they have wings on their legs instead of on their backs? Maybe they don't fly around like eagles or butterflies or anything else. Maybe they're just like, well, maybe like Mercury, but I'm not sure. But so this is an attempt to kind of redefine thinking about things that we can't see and getting us to imagine then a broader possibility of modes of transportation. There was also in the 1960s, very early in Paul's career too, I mean, trying to think about working in as contemporaries with other modern artists. There's really a very large push to try to define new kinds of spaces or new kinds of representations. And so that was part of this as well, too. It's kind of a very modern 1960s interpretation, because there was really a philosophy of trying to create new things that didn't necessarily have direct references to previous pieces. I mean, Paul came through a very kind of classical kind of training. He trace his roots back from the teacher to teacher to teacher to teacher, back to Rodin and Degas and Carl Milles. Also, I think Carl Milles and Granlund were both students of Rodin. So if you see, for those of us who are Norwegian, we might see an influence of Granlund in this. It's legitimate, because it comes to us all through Rodin. And I think that's my show. I'll talk primarily about this one. What makes this interesting to me, well, it's a representation of the globe. It seems. I hope you can see that in there. And there's a figure for each continent on the planet to represent the interconnectedness of the family of man, of the connectedness that we have between peoples and nations and land masses. We have a slumbering figure down there again too at the bottom, a semi-fetal figure of Antarctica. I don't know if this would change now with the sense of global warming. The fact about this piece is that it was originally designed for a tractor seat manufacturer in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The tractor seat manufacturer had already chosen an artist to build a sculpture to represent their corporation, but wasn't quite getting off the mark. So the tractor seat manufacturer then contacted Paul to see if he would come up with something that would have a kind of a worldwide global approach, because they really wanted to sell tractor seats all over the planet. That contract fell apart. That was in about the middle to late 1970s, actually. So he came up with this concept thinking he was going to make this huge piece. It was going to have some very, very massive scale to it, quite a bit larger than this by several times. So this tractor seat manufacturer said, yeah, well, I want something really colossal. But he was really only contacting my dad to put more pressure on the artist that he'd already commissioned to do the work. So this piece actually sat languishing as a sketch, basically, out of wire and wax, collecting dust in his shop for quite a long time on the shelves outside the shop. Until then, he got a call asking him to do the piece for Nagasaki. Something interesting about this also, you notice, like any globe that you would see, any kind of map of the world you see in 3D, always has its axis tilted at about a 23 degree? Can't remember. I think it's about a 23 degree angle. Seymour Cray, the president and founder of Cray Research, Cray Computer, actually paid for the shipping of this piece to Nagasaki. And so while they were loading this onto an airplane, what was Northwest Orient Airline at the time, Seymour and Paul were sitting kind of admiring it. And well, if you kind of look at the human head, you notice that human heads don't necessarily, I don't know if mine sticks out real nicely, but the neck usually attaches to the back of the head in a very, very kind of similar angle as the axis of the planet is to vertical. And so as they're loading this on the plane, Paul's trying to describe this to Seymour Cray, and he goes, well, really, I think of it as a way in which ideas shoot through my mind while I'm thinking about things. And so here's this great supercomputer genius. He goes, yeah, me too. I think that feels the same way to me. That, I mean, the sense of creativity would be so similar between great technicians and beautiful art. What Paul really liked about in making this was the fact that he could have the perspective in the world that he believed only God could have, and that was to sit or stand in the middle, the inside looking out. And he thought that was really a marvelous opportunity that he had never thought of until he was actually in its own presence.